we should probably circle back.
We are good.
We are good.
Can you all hear me? All right. Are we recording, David? We are recording. Okay. Welcome, everybody. My name is Gene Jones. I'm the executive director for an organization in Tallahassee called the Southern Waste Information Exchange. If you haven't heard of us, my quick 30-second elevator pitch is we're basically a clearinghouse for industry and municipalities on waste issues. I kind of act as a matchmaker, putting waste generators in touch with waste users. We also conduct a number of different environmental events in the industry related to, we run the Florida Remediation Conference, we do an MGP redevelopment symposium, we run a waste conversion technology conference, Southeast Recycling Conference, agricultural plastic recycling conference, and of course this one that started from me sitting in a session in Marco 4 years ago, trying to learn something about PFAS, which I had no idea what it was and why I even wanted to sit in on my class, but boy, am I glad I did. So that particular session, which a lot of our presenters that you will hear from today, Jorge, Ralph, Robin, Michael, Ron Noble, Howard Nelson, there's a whole host, although Howard's not here this year. A host of presenters, experts on the subject will be presenting over the next day and a half, right? A couple of opening comments, if you will allow me. First off, real quickly, just the attendance, 247 as of this morning. We'll probably have a couple more walk-ins, so we'll be over the 250 mark. We had 221 last year, which is about average over the last 3 years, right? Please silence your cell phones. We are doing this event both in person and virtually. For our virtual attendees, I'm going to ask that you do two things for me. One, turn off your mic, so go mute, and turn off your camera so that we don't record anything that you don't want anybody else to see. Let's see here. The other things, restrooms are out this door for our in-person attendees to the left by the elevator bank and left again. Conference support, if you need anything, have any problems, please see myself, Norbert, who's sitting up here, raise your hand, Norbert, my wife, Dana, out at the front desk, Summer, or Dennis. Proceedings, I know many of you have already started asking the questions about, are the presentations going to be made available? Yes, they are. We'll shoot everything to PDF. All the sessions are being recorded, and I'll compile that into a proceedings and get that out to everybody. We also will provide a list of attendees. If you're a regular registrant, you're going to get names and affiliations. If you're a VIP registrant, a sponsor or exhibitor, you're going to get the entire list. So with that point, if you do not want your contact information released, please let me know. Abstracts and speakers are in the compendium that I sent out. So I'm going to ask moderators not to read bios for everybody. We're going to try to speed up the process and get right into the nuts and bolts of what we're here to discuss. Last thing to go over is networking opportunities. All the breaks and receptions are going to be in the exhibit hall next door. If you actually have, you can take out the idea of additional drink tickets, because I think we've the hotels agreed to put in a cash bar after we go through our drink tickets that are in the back of our name badges. VIP reception, for those of you that are taking place, VIP reception at Topgolf is sold out. For those of you that are joining us tonight, we unfortunately are going to have to move it up half hour. So it's going to start at 7 o'clock. So we've got 3 hours of play time, but I know I had published it at 7:30, and that's a mistake on my part. I wasn't paying attention to the contract, but we have to start at 7. So 7 o'clock tonight at Topgolf, right after the reception ends in the exhibit hall. Yesterday, I mentioned we had some discussion at the workshop that Michael ran. By the way, thank you, Michael. It was a great way to start the forum off, about sharing information. So if you want, I would encourage everybody to join the LinkedIn group. You can use that QR code right there in front of you. I'll send these slides out to everybody, so if you don't want to do it. But it's a way to get updated information of what's going on in the industry. Lastly, certificate of attendance for the PEs, PGs, and the attorneys in the room. We actually got CLE credit this year. So if you need that, we have a certificate of attendance that we can send out to everybody. There is a fee. It's $25 to go through that, as long as there's an affidavit of attendance form that you're going to need to complete. Lastly, this conference would not be possible if it weren't for our sponsors, our gold sponsors, our silver sponsors. Again, I can't tell you and stress how important it is for us to put on a conference, because it is not cheap working in some of these hotels without the sponsors and exhibitors. So thank you, sponsors and exhibitors, and I encourage you all to network in the exhibit hall after we get through with our meetings into the receptions. Supporting organizations who organized this, SWIX, Florida State University, Environmental University, NSTEP, and then the ICM, which is my wife's organization. Lastly, a little bit of promotion work, where our next conference is going to be Florida Remediation Conference back here at the Rosen Center, November 1st through 3rd. And with that point, I'll get right into the process, or the start of the forum itself. Sitting in that session in Marco, hearing the term PFAS and what it meant, when I first heard, it took me forever to try to understand what the term PFAS, PFAS, right? And then getting into the chemical pronunciations. Now, I had the hardest time, and I was sitting talking to my wife one day, and I said, I don't know how to pronounce this. I'm not a chemist. My background's in marketing and sales. I have no idea how to do this. And we were sitting there talking. Our dog turned around and said, Dad, y'all haven't met Miko. He's up at the front desk. He said, I know how to pronounce it. I said, you do? I said, well, what does it mean, smarty pants? Very good. So with that, I ended up looking at a couple articles. In fact, Jorge and Ralph wrote this particular article that just appeared in the Florida Bar Journal, right? And I started off with how do you pronounce that? And again, Miko chimed in real quick. Apocalypse. So say that 10 times fast. I would encourage you to read this article. There's a QR code for it. So a little bit of promotion for you gentlemen. Thank you for what it is that you all do for the industry. So with that, I'm going to turn this session so we can get started right away to our moderator, Jorge Caspary, who is principal with Carmen Cole. And I've known this gentleman for quite a while when he was with the department. And I value his expertise and his input for the industry. So with that, sir, it is all yours.
Hey, thanks everybody. My name's Jorge Caspary. I'm impressed that we're all together here. If you are coming out from out of state, welcome to Florida. It's a beautiful state. If you were born here and live elsewhere, welcome back from exile, and we're gonna get going on this. Yes, 4 years ago, few of us could anticipate or could even pronounce PFAS. Nobody knew what was going on. So let me just start on this. This is the inaugural panel. So what is new? Let's do a comparison 2019 to 2023. In 2019, we kind of knew the beef apocalypse may be coming, but we were not very sure. Now, we know it's almost certain this thing's gonna happen. 2019, we had an indication that these substances were just about everywhere would be sampled. Now we know they're everywhere. 2019, we had zero idea of the costs of remediation. Nobody could put anything on it. 2023, we have a general idea, and the general idea is that there's not enough money to remediate, that we're probably in a different paradigm. 2019, EPA was grappling with the issue. 2023, EPA has made huge advances, and you'll hear from the EPA panelists in a few minutes. 2019, we were flying by the seat of our pants on screening, analytical methods, and how to evaluate data. By now, we got a good grasp. I mean, we're scientists, engineers, everybody here. So we know pretty much how to evaluate the data. 2019, if you remember summer school, Florida was waking up to this. Granted, DOD had long been doing this, mainly because they have the money. But Florida was waking up to this. The famous 62780 letters went out to cities, and cities began to say, why? What's going on? 2023, Florida has taken a slow walk on how to address compared to states like Michigan, Minnesota, Maine. And there are some reasons for that. More on this later. Let's see I want to point out some liability settlements to you. The 1998 Tobacco Master Settlement was $206 billion, and they're still paying. A couple of tobacco companies went bankrupt. The asbestos settlement trust fund amount was about $30 billion, and Johns Manville went bankrupt. They're still paying. You see the mesothelioma ads for attorneys. That's the settlement. Philip Morris tobacco settlement was $28 billion. Philip Morris is not operating in the U.S. Deepwater was about $60 billion payout up to 2022. BP got rid of their solar and wind assets to pay for this. They don't have anything in that regard. They're strictly a upstream and downstream operator. So what is an estimate of the cost to assess and remediate plus personal injury claims for PFAS? Your guess is as good as mine. But I think one thing's very sure, for certain, and Ralph will address this. The money that's going to come out of the litigation is probably not enough for everybody that's suing to remediate, quote and unquote, remediate PFAS, because up until now, we cannot destruct it in situ. So where are we since 2019, and what have we learned? It's a very multifaceted issue. Remediation will be long, and there's no in situ destruction yet. I want to emphasize that. We are beginning to understand advances in macro risk. Some of these plumes are very long, and therefore many people may be affected versus the gas station approach, which is micro risk. We got to clean up the gas station. In this case, some plumes are area wide, and so we understand the macro risk approach. We really are still lost, in my opinion, on the meaning of a hazardous substance designation later in 2023. As Gene said, if you have the time, read what Ralph and I wrote. That's truly a storm of litigation that may be coming. But we don't know what's going to happen. Is that going to affect, as Michael said yesterday, real estate transaction? What about a reopener clause under CERCLA for sites that you guys have closed? There are many unanswered questions. There is a strong push at the state legislature and at federal legislature for cleanup liability relief. Airports, they use this because they were mandated. So we'll see what that happens. Part of the FAA reauthorization this year is that Congress gives airports liability relief. Who will pay for addressing this? Probably all of us will. Our grandkids will. There's not enough money to remediate PFAS. It's just clearly established. And I think the most important is we probably need a new paradigm at the regulatory agencies. Complete cleanup to 4 parts per trillion or 0 may not be reachable. We're still struggling to clean up vinyl chloride and benzene. That little point of diminishing returns between 10 parts per billion and 1 for benzene is the most expensive. I was a director at the EP. Most of the expenses in cleanup are between 10 and 1. Trying to reach to that holy grail is the most difficult and most expensive aspect. Imagine if we have to clean 4 parts per trillion. It's going to be immense. We may be able to clean it to 70, and we probably will in situ at some point in time. But to 4 or 0, that's going to be a societal cost that few of us can bear. I think going with what DEP and the statute says, we got to reduce the source. Control exposure through point of use. Whoever is drinking this has to be made whole. It has to have some carbon filtration. But overall, who's going to clean up my lawn plume is going to have some form of long-term risk management. So that may be the paradigm we got to think. So what are the hot topics we'll be discussing to the conference? Human health protection under CERCLA. Under CERCLA, as you know, we must clean to MCLs. But in Florida, Rebecca is an error. It is an error. Given funding limitations right now, there is not a cleanup program in Florida. There isn't one. Is Rebecca an answer? I believe it is. The hazardous substances designation under CERCLA. What is the effect on transactions? Reopeners, retroactive liability. Nobody's got the answer yet until that designation comes through, and then all bets are off. I mean, it's open season on reopeners. There are thousands of PFAS. We're beginning to scratch what I call the first inch of a surface of a huge iceberg. What do we tell our clients? Prepare for additional regulation and possible budget for regulatory response. As you all know, the EPA has asked for comments on, I think, 5 or 6 additional PFAS to be regulated. Well, what do you tell your clients? Excuse me, you got to prepare for this as well. The Gen X's who are touted as less toxic. So those are the issues we'll be discussing in the conference. PFAS regulation under RCRA. I worked in RCRA for a very long time, so has Mr. DeMeo. Once in RCRA, you're forever in RCRA, forever. You don't get out of RCRA. The average time for a site in RCRA corrective action is usually decades. You know, from the moment you get a post-closure permit to the moment you get an NFA, this may be decades. I'm dealing with sites that have been around since the 90s. And for PFAS, since it's a forever chemical, RCRA may be in centuries. I mean, I tell folks, I'll retire on PFAS. My grandkids, if they're geologists or engineers, they'll retire on PFAS. I mean, it's just that simple. The big one in Florida, surface water. The interlink between groundwater and surface water in Florida, as you probably know, geologists, engineers, is strong. So what happens when groundwater discharges to surface water's body? To a surface water body, that's an outstanding Florida water. Non-degradation, you cannot contaminate that. What's going to happen? Who is going to clean that up? Especially if it's a hazardous substance. Something has to be done. How to even begin to prepare to address for surface water issues, airports, seaports. We're not there yet. All we know is that DEP's got a screening level criteria for surface water, but beyond that, eventually surface water will be regulated if it is a hazardous substance. CERCLA, cleanup on the average from listing is about 20 years. I say more, about 35 years from a Superfund site from listing to complete cleanup. The average cost of a cleanup for a CERCLA site is $43 million. And as per government accounting office, economic effects of cleanup are elusive. So these are some of the hot topics we'll be discussing between today and tomorrow. 23 and beyond. That's my introductory slides. Let's bring our panelists. We have Ms. Aaryn Jones with the EPA, so she's going to give us some EPA updates. Mr. Ralph DeMeo, who is litigating most of the Florida cases in federal court. And Stephanie Fiorenza, it's a beautiful last name, Florence. She's going to give us an update on what is the site screening ASTM, method selection, data evaluation, and sampling guidance. So without any further ado, I am going to ask Ms. Jones to step up to the podium, introduce herself, and get us going.
Thanks, Jorge, and thanks everybody for having me here today to kind of roll out where we are with EPA's PFAS roadmap. My name is Aaryn Jones. I'm an emerging contaminants coordinator in EPA Region 4 in Atlanta. So that's the regional office that's over the 8 states of the Southeast and includes Florida, of course. So I've been in that role for about a year, and I would say emerging contaminants has been almost all PFAS for me because it is such a big issue and cross-media issue. And as we are halfway through our roadmap that was released in October of 2021, we're really getting close to some of the policies that we've set, inching towards some of them finalizing. We're really getting to where the rubber meets the road. So it's interesting to be in a regional office connecting with the states and where they've moved out in some cases ahead of us. And so it's an interesting space to be in right in the middle of the roadmap. So I will cover what we've done the last year and a half and also cover our big commitments that we still have through 2024 this morning. For the overview, I am going to assume that you folks here know that this is a class of challenging compounds, and we'll kind of skip some of the background issues, some of the broad contamination issues that PFAS present. I think everybody here at least has a somewhat of a grasp on that, but if you're curious about PFAS history or anything like that, feel free to ask me. I can give you that version one-on-one. But again, we'll go through the roadmap. Each of our program offices has specific commitments, so we'll go slide by slide through that. I am going to be skipping over certain things. I will be focusing mostly on water and on the cleanup side today for this audience. Skipping a little bit of our TSCA actions on the prevention side, but if you're curious about those, feel free to let me know, and I can give you a good update on kind of all the good work on under TSCA and the toxics release inventory that connects to PFAS. So EPA Administrator Michael Regan, came to EPA in March of 2021, and in April he had already charged, our senior leaders to come up with a PFAS council, cross media leaders, policy leaders, and technical leaders from program offices and from regional offices. So this council is co-chaired by our Assistant Administrator for the Office of Water, Radhika Fox, and EPA's Regional Administrator from Region 1, which is in New England, David Cash. And so this council met Regan's call for a strategic roadmap, which again was released in October 2021, and it was set to do several things, including set clear timelines for our actions from 2021 through 2024, fill a critical gap in federal leadership. Again, a lot of states have moved out on PFAS ahead of the federal government. We have that patchwork effect across the country as far as approaches to PFAS. So this is looking to kind of set a baseline of federal leadership and support the state's ongoing efforts and build on our commitment to restore scientific integrity. So I'll return to specific commitments in our roadmap in a few minutes. Again, going to largely skip this slide, but if you've heard of PFAS, you've probably heard of at least PFOA and PFAS, the two most well understood PFAS. So a lot of our policy work that we've moved out on is focused on these two, but there are a handful of other PFAS that we do have enough toxicity information to kind of move out and begin to group in other PFAS. And so you'll see, at least in the drinking water rule, you'll see that. And I'll also lay out some of our circle of lists and screening levels that have pulled in other PFAS that have final peer-reviewed tox data. That's gone beyond PFOA and PFAS, but those are very much the most understood of all the PFAS. And of course, PFAS life cycle, these chemicals are persistent in the environment. They're also mobile in the environment. They just present some very unique challenges from when they're created and how they're managed as waste, as far as other chemicals that EPA is more familiar with how they behave as far as fate and transport. So we're still learning in some cases how they behave, but we're looking to consider that full life cycle as we move out in our various programs to address PFAS. And of course, we're looking to hold polluters accountable, get upstream. That's one thing I hear a lot about is kind of now discharge. Can we prevent PFAS from being released in the first place? And so that's certainly a big focus of the roadmap. And we're looking to prioritize the protection of disadvantaged communities. You'll see these three R's connect to all of our program commitments throughout the roadmap. So research, restrict, remediate. Again, for a lot of PFAS, we are very much in the research mode and trying to build that technical foundation. But in some cases, again, PFOA, PFAS, and some others, we're moving out with restrict actions and rulemakings and policies and where they've been released in the environment. And we understand that they present a problem, we're moving forward to accelerate remediation as well. So you'll see these three R's kind of connect to our commitments in the slides that are coming. Just to cover really quickly, again, we're halfway through our roadmap. So we have had a number of accomplishments since October of 2021, and we had our first annual report in November of last year. So that report highlights, the actions that we had taken. We've proposed a national primary drinking water regulation for 6 PFAS. We have proposed to designate 2 PFAS as hazardous substances under surplus. We'll cover all these in more detail. We've released drinking water health advisories for 4 PFAS, We've laid the foundation for enhancing data on PFAS, and we've distributed 10 billion in funding to address emerging contaminants like PFAS under the bipartisan infrastructure law. We've expanded our scientific understanding and translated that science into our efforts. We've proactively used enforcement tools, and one of those tools that our Office of Enforcement and Compliance Assurance released is the PFAS Analytic tool. So if you didn't know that was out, that went public in January. So if you Google EPA PFAS Analytic tool, it's a mapping tool, and you can kind of zero into a state. It's pulling in multimedia data. So I find it to be a very interesting and useful tool, and it's going to continue to pull more and more information into it and present it kind of in a map format. And you can dig deep into the data, the spreadsheets that you know the data was pulled from, so you can really use it to kind of hone in on any locality and maybe look for sources and that kind of thing. So make sure you check out that tool. We've also engaged with our federal partners and the public. Much of our work's been informed by public webinars, stakeholder meetings, congressional testimony, and engagement with EPA's federal advisory committees. We're also coordinating with our federal agency partners, recognizing that we need to harness the collective experience and knowledge of and the capacity of the federal government to address this issue. And in addition to highlighting the actions that EPA has taken, that report also forecast some of the big items to come, which again, with finalizing that drinking water regulation that we proposed just in March, final action on the proposed CERCLA designation for PFOA and PFAS, continuing to improve chemical data and safety, restricting those upstream PFAS discharges to waterways, addressing PFAS and biosolids, and engaging with communities. We just wrapped up 10 regional sessions on the roadmap. Ours was in March. And those recordings just posted last week. So if you want to kind of hear those are out in the, on our webpage now, where we engage with communities and got listening session feedback on the roadmap across the country. So this takes us to the first of our program office slides. This is the Office of Research and Development. Again, lots of investment in research going on for EPA in this office to improve that scientific understanding where we're building our technical foundation. We're working to develop and validate methods to detect and measure PFAS in the environment. In the next slide, I've kind of pulled together some of the methods that we have that are for various media, and just kind of give you a status update on EPA methods there. So we'll cover that in just a second. We're also working to advance science to assess the human health and environmental risks of PFAS. So our scientists are developing human health toxicity assessments for additional PFAS. So just recently, the final toxicity assessment for PFHXA was released, which is a shorter chain PFAS, and a draft tox assessment went out for public comment for PFDA, which is a longer chain PFAS. So, you know, continuing in our IRIS pipeline, we're looking at various PFAS, and that gives us the technical toxicity basis to kind of bring more PFAS into the regulatory sphere. We're also compiling and summarizing available and relevant scientific information, identifying PFAS sources, looking at the ways they move in the environment and the pathways by which people can be exposed. And we're also characterizing how that exposure might contribute to cumulative impacts on communities. And the third thing is we're working to evaluate and develop technologies for reducing PFAS in the environment, drinking water and wastewater treatment, contaminated site cleanup and remediation, air emission controls, and end-of-life materials management. So there's a big investment in research for EPA, and it covers all those. This is that method slide I was talking about. Probably a good reference. Kind of lays out when the method was published, the number of PFAS compounds it covered, and notes about the various matrices or types of PFAS that the method includes. Most of these methods here are final methods, but draft method 1633 is a current collaboration between EPA and DoD to achieve a multi-lab validation of that for 40 PFAS and many different matrices. So there's a lot of interest in that method, kind of as the more non-drinking water PFAS method. So we're currently on the third version of that draft method, and it includes, the third version includes the quality control criteria for the wastewater matrix, which we know there's been a lot of interest in the wastewater matrix because there's a lot of people trying to better understand PFAS and discharges. Projecting that we will finalize this method for all of the matrices during 2023. So it's on track to finalize by later this year. There's a link at the bottom of this slide. You can kind of explore these methods and other EPA methods further, in addition to resources on sampling and data analysis. This is what I'm going to skip today, so I won't be covering it in depth, but I want to highlight there's a lot of prevention work going on the, that connects to the restrict goal in our roadmap. This being led by our Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention. So this is where we implement the two laws, TSCA, the Toxic Substances Control Act, and the Toxic Relief Inventory Program, which you might have heard as TRI. So again, check our webpage if you want to learn more about those actions, or feel free to ask me more about it later. And this is the big one, our Office of Water. There's a lot of actions here where we're taking to restrict PFAS through EPA's programs for drinking water and also to protect our nation's lakes, rivers, and streams. On March 14th, we took that key step to protect public health by proposing the first ever national drinking water standard for 6 PFAS, which is fulfilling a major foundational commitment of our roadmap. The next couple of slides, I'll kind of run through some high level, just so you can see what is in that rulemaking, because there's so much interest in it. So I've kind of added some slides on that. But again, it would establish legally enforceable levels for these 6 PFAS that are known to occur in drinking water. And so we're also working to improve drinking water data through monitoring, toxicity assessments, and health advisories. We're currently taking important steps to monitor drinking water in communities across the country through our 5th Unregulated Contaminant Monitoring Rule, or UCMR 5. So this program is testing for 29 different PFAS it started at the beginning of 2023, and it's going to run through 2025 in thousands of drinking water systems nationwide. So if you remember an earlier round of this kind of EPA monitoring from 2013 to 2015, there were some PFAS that we discovered were occurring nationally in drinking water. And so with this latest rule, we're taking it a step further. We'll be looking at nearly 5 times more PFAS, and significantly more water systems are participating. And we're using methods that can detect PFAS at much lower levels than the last round of sampling that we did. So we're going to be sitting on a lot of PFAS data in drinking water over the next couple of years. Here in Region 4 for the 8 states of the Southeast, 2,200 public water systems will be participating, serving over 60 million customers. So again, it's just going to be a lot of data and a lot of PFAS information about the drinking water exposures. As I mentioned earlier, in June of 2022, we released 4 health advisories in our Office of Water, interim health advisories for PFOA and PFAS, and final health advisories for PFBS and Gen X chemicals. Then flip into the clean water side, we're working to develop national technology-based discharge limits for industries that use PFAS through our Effluent Limitation Guidelines program. So in January of this year, we released a final ELG Plan 15, which outlines some key steps towards addressing PFAS and discharges across a range of industrial categories. So we've announced previously that rulemakings are underway for chemical manufacturers and for electroplaters and metal finishing. And a new announcement was landfills due to leachate discharges. So those rulemakings are underway for discharges where you may have PFAS. We're also expanding studies of textile manufacturers and announced a new study of publicly owned treatment works, POTWs, that have industrial influence. So EPA is looking to study industrial influence for POTWs. Also under the Clean Water Act, we're working to address PFAS and permitting, and through analytical methods, water quality criteria, and fish advisories, looking to leverage the Clean Water Act's primary permitting program known as the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, or NPDES, to improve monitoring and reduce PFAS discharges to waterways. In December 2022, we released a guidance to states to describe how to leverage those permits and pretreatment programs to increase monitoring, including at known or suspected discharges of PFAS. So we're also working on improved analytical methods. Again, that method 1633 that I was talking about. And in April 2022, over a year ago, we released draft aquatic life water quality criteria for PFOA and PFAS, which reflects the latest peer-reviewed scientific knowledge. We got a lot of comments on that, and we're expecting that to come out soon. And again, that will show the effects of these chemicals on freshwater aquatic organisms. We're also looking to enhance data availability on PFAS and fish tissue to help states and tribes set PFAS fish advisories. And finally, another big one, as I referenced earlier, we are working on to evaluate the risk of PFAS and biosolids. So where we are with that is we're looking to finalize a risk assessment, again, for PFOA and PFAS that would serve as a basis for determining whether regulation of those two PFAS and biosolids is appropriate. So that was all of our Office of Water's commitments, maybe not all, but the big ones. Again, go to our webpage if you really want to dig deep. The next couple of slides are kind of some I pulled out of our National Primary Drinking Water Rule webinar, just to give you a quick overview of that rulemaking that's proposed. Comment period still open. So just wanted to make sure y'all understood kind of at a high level what's in that. So these legally enforceable levels are called maximum contaminant levels, MCLs for 6 PFAS in drinking water. PFOA and PFAS are being proposed as individual contaminants, and PFHXS, PFNA, PFBS, and GenX as a PFAS mixture. We're also proposing health-based, non-enforceable contaminant level goals, which are called MCLGs for these 6 PFAS. And MCLGs are the maximum level of contaminant in drinking water where there's no known anticipated negative health effects, and we allow for a margin of safety when we come up with those numbers as well. So this lays it out in the table for you. You can see them side by side, and you can see that the proposed health-based goals, again, the non-enforceable goals for PFOA and PFAS are set to 0. And this is due to the fact that they have been determined to be likely human carcinogens. And this is consistent with how we address setting goals for known or likely carcinogens under the Safe Drinking Water Act. So we set those levels at 0, the goal levels at 0. The proposed MCLs for PFOA and PFAS are set to 4 parts per trillion. And we set those goals, or we set those numbers, not the goals, as close as we can, as close as feasible to those goals, to those health goals. For feasibility determinations, we look at the availability of analytical methods to be able to get to that level, and also whether or not there are treatment technologies readily available to treat to those levels. So again, that's that feasibility determination that the Safe Drinking Water Act takes when setting enforceable levels. For the 4 PFAS proposed to be addressed as a mixture, we have a unitless hazard index of 1 for both the proposed MCLG and the enforceable MCL. So we'll look a little bit more about what that is and how to calculate it on the next slide. So just quickly showing the calculation, this really helped me kind of wrap my head around it faster than I would have otherwise. I think the visual helps. The calculation is basically a sum of fractions. So for each chemical, you take the exposure level, which is the blue drop on top. So that's what's actually in your drinking water. And then you divide that by a health-based water concentration, which is the red stop sign shape in the figure. So those numbers on the bottom are the levels of each of those PFAS that are determined not to have negative health effects. And so it's basically kind of a ratio of what's in the water to the health effect for each individual chemical. You sum up those fractions, which is again a ratio of exposure to risk, and you get a hazard index value. If that value exceeds 1 as a running annual average, it would be a violation of the proposed hazard index MCL. That's just kind of quickly explaining how the hazard index approach works for those 4 PFAS. This proposed rule would require public water systems to monitor for these PFAS, notify the public of the levels of these PFAS, and reduce the levels of the PFAS in drinking water if they exceeded the proposed standards. So again, it's open for public comment right now through May 30th. We have held 2 public webinars and we have held a public hearing. And so all of those proceedings are available on the webpage. Again, you can get to anything we're doing at EPA. You can get epa.gov/PFAS. So go there if you want to learn more or view those webinars in detail. Flipping to the cleanup and air side of our roadmap commitments. This is our Office of Land and Emergency Management's commitments, which houses our cleanup programs, and our Office of Air and Radiation, where our team of experts work to address air issues. So first, we'll talk about the specific action I highlighted earlier under CERCLA, where in September 2022, we published in the Federal Register a proposed rule to designate PFOA and PFAS as hazardous substances under CERCLA. If finalized, the rule would require facilities across the country to report PFOA and PFAS releases that meet or exceed the reportable quantity for those substances. And then we look, the rule would help us enhance the ability of federal, tribal, state, and local authorities to obtain information regarding the location and extent of those releases, enhance EPA's ability and other agencies to respond to releases or threats of release, and also establish a national consistency in the evaluation and cleanup of PFOA and PFAS, and encourage better waste management practices. And so I know there was a lot of talk last night about kind of liability and all appropriate inquiry and that type of thing too. So one other thing to point out for y'all is that if that becomes final and they become circular hazardous substances, it becomes folded into that as well, where it would be required. They'd go from non-scope contaminants to something that you would need to include in a phase one. So also as identified in the roadmap, we intend to take final action on this proposed rule in 2023. And we're continuing to work really closely with stakeholders to better understand equity concerns around this rule. We got 60,000 comments on this proposed rulemaking. And so just a month or so ago, we held 2 listening sessions on a potential CERCLA enforcement discretion policy. Again, those slides and recordings are available on our webpage if you want to go kind of hear more about that. But the main focus was on manufacturers, federal facilities. EPA intends to focus on manufacturers and federal facilities or folks who have resulted in the release of significant amounts of PFAS. We may choose to not take CERCLA enforcement action against certain entities, which were laid out in those sessions. We may settle and provide CERCLA contribution protection to certain parties. And the 4 that we listed in those listening sessions were water utilities and POTWs, publicly owned municipal solid waste landfills, farms that apply biosolids, and certain airports and fire departments that are state, tribal, or locally owned. Oops, I need to go to the next slide. Sorry. As an additional step, we took an advanced and issued an advanced notice of proposed rulemaking on April 13th. So this created quite a hubbub too. We're seeking comment on designating whether EPA should designate other PFAS chemicals under CERCLA as hazardous substances. So that public comment is still open as well through June 12th. And again, I think Jorge mentioned earlier, this is 7 PFAS. We're getting feedback on whether or not we should look at these 7 PFAS, but we also highlight whether or not we should look at groups of PFAS or precursors to PFAS. So, and this again is not a proposed rule. This is us asking for feedback on how we might propose a rule. So it's a key. We're really looking for robust feedback here about how to move forward beyond PFOA and PFAS under CERCLA. Next, under RCRA, we're planning to propose 2 regulations in 2023. One is a proposed rule to add specific PFAS to the list of hazardous constituents, which would mean these PFAS are subject to corrective action requirements. And second, we plan to issue a clarifying regulation that emerging contaminants, such as PFAS, can be cleaned up through the RCRA corrective action process. So there's two RCRA proposals that will be coming out soon. And again, I'd like to make this point when we're talking about RCRA, this would not bring PFAS under the full regulatory umbrella of RCRA from cradle to grave waste management, but it does clarify our authority on the corrective action side when PFAS have been released and need to be cleaned up. The third item on this slide highlights EPA's commitment to take significant steps towards updating our research and guidance on destruction and disposal technologies. And we have a deadline to update our previous guidance in December, was issued in December 2020 by this December of 2023. So we got 5,000 comments on that guidance document 3 years ago, which is a lot of comments for a guidance document. And it failed to kind of highlight a path forward for destruction and disposal because we had so much gaps in knowledge about fate and transport and that type of thing. So again, hoping with all of the research that's been going on the last 3 years that our next iteration of this guidance will have a little more substance to it and be less of a gap identification and hopefully we'll start to see some paths forward. Finally, our Office of Air and Radiation is taking steps to restrict PFAS by building that technical foundation for potential regulation under the Clean Air Act. So we're looking to identify sources of PFAS, develop monitoring approaches and information on mitigation technologies, and looking to increase our understanding of the fate and transport of PFAS and air emissions. So again, all of this technical foundation building will work to support future decisions on whether to designate PFAS as hazardous air pollutants under the Clean Air Act. And this is another slide I added just kind of for audiences like this that might be interested in understanding the various levels as we have them right now. This is a little detail on how 8 different PFAS acids are being addressed through our CERCLA risk assessment process. So for the CERCLA program, regional screening levels, RSLs, are used to do site screening to help identify areas, contaminants, and conditions that require, further attention as a Superfund site. And regional removal management levels, or RMLs, are used to help identify areas and contaminants and conditions where removal action might be appropriate under CERCLA. And so again, I sometimes hesitate to put this up. I'm not a CERCLA risk assessor. So if you start asking me really detailed questions about this, you may hit a wall, but I can definitely get you to an expert. But again, I just wanted to kind of highlight the fact that CERCLA has these numbers, and this is how CERCLA typically works to do risk assessment. And PFAS are now, as of last May, on this list. And we just added 2 more. We just added the ones at the bottom, PFBA and PFHXA, because they, over the last 6 months, got a final toxicity value under IRIS. And so as we have more and more PFAS that have final peer-reviewed toxicity data, every 6 months, generally, these tables are updated, and new PFAS potentially will be added to this list going forward as we learn more and more about their toxicity. Let's see. So again, just to kind of clarify how these tables work and how Superfund moves forward on a site-specific basis. When Office of Water finalizes their science or their toxicity values that support the MCL, so that other proposed rule I presented earlier, if that finalizes, EPA would consider updates to these tables as well. So those tox values that are the basis of our water action, they become final. The numbers may change here for PFOA and PFAS, for example. Also, I already said that. I've been doing these presentations every week, and everything keeps changing every week, so I'm trying to make sure I don't miss anything. This slide is showing the tap water values, again, for those 8 acids. There are, just if you go dig deep into this, there are other PFAS technically that show up when you go to the RSL calculator, but they're the salt or the anion forms of these acids. So these are the basic 8 acids that we have on the table right now. And the final note is if the agency determines a long-term cleanup action under CERCLA is warranted, the MCLs and any final drinking water regulations, so if our proposed rule finalizes, they would generally be considered as ARRs, or the applicable and relevant and appropriate requirements on a site-specific basis. And cleanup remedies must comply with ARRs unless they're waived. So just kind of wanted to lay out on the CERCLA side of the world what the numbers are looking like. These are rounded numbers. The calculator spits out because it's not exact, hard and fast. They're not cleanup numbers, but this is the tools that are available to our CERCLA risk assessors on a site-specific basis. And we'll end with the bipartisan infrastructure law, just so that y'all know that we do luckily have $10 billion to begin addressing PFAS in drinking water and on the Clean Water Act side as well. So the bipartisan infrastructure law uses 3 of EPA's existing water finance programs, but it focuses them specifically on PFAS and emerging contaminants. So the $4 billion will flow through the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, another $1 billion through the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, and a $5 billion chunk is to provide grants to address emerging contaminants for smaller disadvantaged communities. So again, we're really excited that we do have these funds available to begin addressing exposures in drinking water, and also on the Clean Water Act side. Our regional office has made nearly $495 million available here in Region 4 to address PFAS. And again, we're thrilled that these funds will enable communities to invest in PFAS treatment solutions, and while we continue to take action to research, restrict, and remediate under our PFAS roadmap. So I covered an awful lot, and I skipped an awful lot too. And so I do encourage you to check out our webpage or reach out to me if you want to know anything more in depth about any of our actions. But again, there's just a wealth of information on our webpage that you can kind of dig deeper and go in any direction you choose. So thanks for your time, and I'll take questions.
Yeah, we're going to be having a QA session at the end of the presenters. So that's just bear with. I know you guys have a lot of questions. I do. Let's just wait for the rest of the presenters to end, and then we'll begin our QA. Thank you. Next is Ralph DeMeo with Guilday Law. Ralph, introduce yourself.
Thank you. Yes, appreciate that, Aaryn. I'm excited about everything that's starting to happen now. I've been doing this for about 40 years. I've been involved with every, chemical you can imagine. I defended the EDB manufacturers in the 80s. The last time I remember a part per trillion criteria being promote it. Worked on dioxin, asbestos, you name it. And I can tell you that I have never seen anything quite like this PFAS phenomenon, if I can call it that. I mean, your presence here today shows that. It's incredible, really. My story was very much like Gene's. Congratulations, Gene, on having the vision to see where this was going. I got a call from a good friend of mine, Brad Pekas, with Trihydro about 5 years ago, and he said, "Hey, do you know anything about PFAS?" And I said, "Not really." "Why should I?" And he said, "Yeah, I think you should." And he involved me in a program that had, I think, 15 people there. Now we've got 250 people. So it's pretty remarkable, really. And, you know, it's referred to as the forever chemical. Some of you have heard me say before that I think, based on what you're hearing today, it's really the everywhere chemical. I think they ought to change the name. I get asked all the time, you know, should I test for it? And I say, only if you want to find it, because the chances are you're going to find it, right? I found out a couple of days ago it's in contact lenses. I asked my good friend, Dr. Teef, whom you're going to hear from later today, is this something else I need to worry about? And he said, no, you're exposed to so many other things. Don't sweat it. So I said, thanks. I feel better already. So, you know, this is a remarkable situation for us. As Jorge said, there's careers that are being made and will be made on this for better or worse. It's a serious problem. It's been actually looked at for a long, long time, but now in the last 2 years or so, you're starting to see some real developments. And one of the developments I'm going to talk about, I'll skip over all the basic stuff that you all know already, but as Gene said, you're going to get the presentation. But really, you've heard from EPA. Again, I included comprehensively, but I'll skip over all of this. I agree with what you heard a few minutes ago, that the stormwater problem, to me, I mean, we all have a pretty good idea of how to deal with groundwater. We have a pretty good idea generally how to assess and manage it, remediate it. But when you talk about stormwater, particularly non-point sources, it boggles the mind, really. I'm really not sure how we're going to deal with that. And also, as my good friend Jorge said, I don't think that there's enough money in the federal treasury to pay for the problem that we're going to see. We are seeing and will continue to see in the PFAS arena. I work with a lot of airports. Of course, airports, starting about 4 or 5 years ago, were one of the focuses, particularly in Florida, of the DEP, because of their use of AFFF foam, is to this day mandated to be used at controlled airports, at commercial airports. It has been used for decades. And I was interested in Aaryn's comment, and I'm a litigator, so I do a lot of that, about holding the polluters responsible. I think that's absolutely fair and appropriate policy, but it's a lot more complicated than that. Virtually every one of my clients, and I have about a dozen of them in the PFAS arena, really use this properly, legally, in conjunction with all appropriate best management practices. And as I said, the commercial airports I represent had no choice but to use it. And I'll give you one of my favorite comments from a municipal fire chief a few years ago that I represent. After listening to all of this, he said, so here's my choice, Ralph. So I get a call from the airport and a plane has crashed and it's on fire and there's 300 people inside. I rush my crew out and I've got to stop for a moment and ask myself, okay, I have a choice here. I can apply the AFFF foam that contains the PFAS and put out the fire and hopefully save lives, risking the environment, or I can not worry so much about the people on fire and save the environment. He said, what do you think I'm going to do, right? And 100% of the time you would hope put out the dadgum fire, right? But then you've released PFAS that gets into surface waters and groundwaters and migrates and potentially causes health effects. That, to me, encapsulated the problem that we are facing with PFAS right now. Now, there's a new product that's been approved by the FAA that doesn't have the same adverse health impacts. They're not mandating its use. And when I asked the FAA official, why aren't you mandating this use? He said, we're concerned about liability issues. I'll leave it at that. You're going to hear from others, our friends at DEP, about all this. They started sending out these letters. We call them 780 letters from 62-780. About 5 years ago, I think it was 18 or so of them were sent out. I have clients, multiple clients that received them. And it was a very carefully worded letter by our good friend Tim Barr at the department. It basically said that we urge you, I'm paraphrasing, to conduct an investigation because we've learned through the public records. Most of these are municipal facilities. Some are DOD facilities, airports, fire training facilities. But we've learned that you've used this chemical and it's a concern. And we'd like you to start investigating. And as we heard from the department when we had our very first big meeting about this 4 years ago now in Tallahassee, this isn't an enforcement action. This is really just, we're doing our job to make sure that we evaluate the significance. And at the time, EPA only had the health advisory level that you've heard about. If you look at the title page of the health advisory level, it says right there, this is not an enforceable standard, okay? And to this day, although there's now rulemaking, we still don't have an enforceable standard. So it was quite a challenge to these facilities. And I got asked by many of them, what do we do? Do we ignore it? Do we do the work? We do the work and we find a problem. What does that mean? And at the time, and I would argue even to this day, it's very difficult to test to parts per trillion. There's very few labs that can do so reliably. And then you've got, what, 5,000 constituent or congeners of PFAS. So which ones are you looking for? And then when you find it, well, what's the standard for cleanup? And what's the technology? We're just going to keep pumping and treating till the cows come home and replace carbon filters. So these issues still exist to this day, which is why all the litigation ensued, which is what I'm going to talk about in a minute. Again, I'm going to skip over the technical stuff. Now, Jorge and Gene asked me to talk a little bit about the legislation. Jorge was very involved in that for a work group that I serve on. And last year, not this session, previous legislative session, we managed to get legislation passed that we tried for what, 2 years before that and hadn't quite gotten the attention of the powers that be in Tallahassee. And essentially what it did was it gave the department till January 1st, 2025 to adopt by rule a statewide cleanup target level. It is widely anticipated that the department is going to adopt whatever EPA comes up with, and that's fair enough. That's where the expertise is. That's where the study has been ongoing for years, and it's not uncommon for the department to do that. We asked the legislature to go a little bit further and immunize those facilities that, I'll use the term, innocently use these chemicals for decades. Again, in some cases being required to do so. The FAA would pull your license if you didn't use that foam in your firefighting. And because fire departments will tell you, well, we have to use the same chemical in our training that we would use in an actual fire event. So they used it in their training. In fact, that's where most of the exposures, that's where most of the contamination came from, spraying large amounts of this foam during practice sessions. The very first facility to get attention was the state's fire college in Ocala. The legislature appropriated $5 million with, I think, another $5 million option just to deal with that one facility, just to figure out what was going on there. And so that gives you a kind of an order of magnitude of what we're looking at in terms of the costs of this situation to us as a practical matter. Well, this past legislative session, we had asked the legislature to go a little bit further than they did in 2022, and that was to adopt the concept that has been in place in Florida for decades, risk-based corrective action, which, you know, we used to call it Global Rebecca back in the day because originally it only applied to 3 programs, dry cleaners, brown fields, and petroleum cleanup sites. Well, the legislature adopted it statewide for all cleanups. And under the one cleanup rule that is now basically in effect in the state, we thought, well, let's codify the concept of risk-based corrective action. Let's focus on receptors. Let's focus on actual risk. Unfortunately, we couldn't get that through the legislature. We also asked that some of you lawyers in particular will be familiar with the delineated areas rule, which is being used by the Department of Water Management Districts, in which we're urging that to be a basis for allowing an exception to imposing land use controls, which can be very onerous on a facility. We didn't get that done either. So we got no legislation this past session on PFAS, but we are all anxiously awaiting first the EPA's action, but then what the state does by way of rulemaking. Again, if you're a betting person, I'd bet on it being 4 parts per trillion. And again, as my good friend Chris Teef said, when we first saw the proposal, 4 parts per trillion is effectively 0. Okay, I mean, in the real world, it's effectively 0. So that's what we're looking at in this world. And I can't really remember anything quite like it, frankly. Okay, and again, there's more information here about the statute that we talked about. Now, Congress has been debating for many years the concept of amending CERCLA. I spent a lot of time in CERCLA and RECRA world. And as you heard from Aaryn, the EPA is pursuing a listing under RECRA possibly as hazardous constituents, and then ultimately, and I would say likely, to be characterized as a hazardous substance under CERCLA. I can tell you kind of a joke that I use for the RECRA universe that I think applies here, and with nod to my good friends down the street at Universal Studios over the entranceway to the Hard Rock Hotel. It says, from the Eagles, you can check out, but you can never leave. Well, when those developments happen with respect to RECRA and CERCLA, there is no getting out of PFAS world, okay? It will be with us for a very, very, very long time. My opinion, I'm not a scientist. I defer to the scientists in the room, but it really cannot be effectively remediated to 0, okay? And so what does that mean as a practical matter? Again, I don't think that Fort Knox has enough gold to pay for the cleanups. If you look at the map of the state of Florida alone, and you look at the areas that are likely affected by PFAS, it's pretty much covers the whole state. Certainly municipal areas, everywhere. It really is the everywhere chemical. I represent airports, fire training facilities, landfills, wastewater treatment plants, public water supply systems. All of the above are impacted by PFAS, okay? All right, well now, where does that leave us? With everything I just said, not a surprise that in our litigious society, we look around for somebody to blame, someone to point the fingers to at, and someone preferably with deep pockets, right? And the municipal clients that I represent and some of the private clients too were, you know, somewhat panicking when they got these letters saying you have to do something about this. Well, what did we do wrong? Actually, they did nothing wrong, but somebody has to pay for it, right? And so far, the states and the federal government have not stepped up to offer any solution in terms of how to pay for it, right? Which I still think is the only way it's going to get fixed. Or create immunities or partial immunities when you act legally. When I represented the EDB manufacturers, that was ultimately the way the EDB cases were settled. It was determined that the state of Florida was following the USDA and the EPA mandate that they use EDB to control nematodes all over the state. And so they had to use it. And the manufacturers then got sued. And one of our defenses was, hey, we were just doing what you told us to do. We ended up actually suing the USDA and the EPA under the Federal Tort Claims Act, and we won that case because it was mandated. Now, I think we have a similar claim here against FAA. Nobody's pulled the trigger on that yet because we're hoping to work cooperatively with them. And I think there are issues there with other agencies, but it is a problem. And you can see the evolution here. The very first litigation involved Teflon coatings, DuPont Teflon. and they were the first defendants. The PFAS constituents are very effective as flame retardants, anti-stick agents, softeners, plastic softeners. That's why they're in contact lenses. And yet we found out about maybe 15, 20 years ago about the toxic effects of it. Of course, those products ended up in people's blood, in landfills, in water treatment plants, wastewater, everywhere. So there was a series of cases that were brought and some big ticket settlements. I was one of the first claimants in the Johns Manville asbestos litigation that some of the old timers will remember. As Jorge said, that company, one of the largest multinational corporations in the world, went bankrupt over asbestos. I think you're going to see the same thing start to happen, unfortunately, with the 3Ms and the DuPonts and the Chemours and the other companies, because I really don't think there's enough money in their coffers to pay for the problem. But the litigation evolved to the point that about 5 years ago, in the state of South Carolina, in federal court, and people always say, why South Carolina? I don't know. I always joke, well, they must have drawn the short straw. I'm sure they had no idea that 5 years later, after the first case was brought there, that there'd be like 2,000 cases pending. I've got several of them. It's in federal court in South Carolina. It's referred to as the multi-district litigation. And basically, there are rules that say, if people are suing all over the country in various courts, state and federal, we don't want to have 2,500 lawsuits going on about the same subject. Let's combine them, consolidate them. And that's what the multi-district litigation is all about. And one judge, who again, probably sorry he signed up to do this, is actually handling all of these. We'll talk more about it in a minute, but the very first case, we call it a bellwether trial, like the bell cow concept, is going to be tried right here in the state of Florida, the city of Stewart case. And it's going to be significant because, as lawyers know, there's a concept called collateral estoppel. We sometimes refer to it as issue preclusion. And issues that are decided in that case will have an impact on all the other cases pending. Issues like the toxic properties. The judge isn't going to want to try that 2,500 times. Fate and transport, human health issues. Things like that are going to be decided in this case, and it's going to affect all of us. It starts next month. So needless to say, we're all going to be watching that. There are a lot of pending motions. The court recently ruled on the evidentiary issue of the Daubert motion. I won't go into that now, but if you have any questions, I just want to give you a flavor of just in Florida alone, the number of cases that are pending. Okay. And you'll notice the second from the bottom, the state of Florida kind of jumped in late and filed its own case against the same manufacturers with basically the same complaint that we all had filed. They actually, interestingly, filed it in Hillsborough County, but it got bumped up to the federal proceeding, the MDL, because that's how it works. Whether you file in state or federal court, they want it all to be heard in the same place. So state of Florida is actually a player in all of this. I think they recognize that there are significant consequences if the manufacturers lose. The liability will be massive. Just to give you a flavor, one of the very earliest settlements was a class action brought by firefighters in a Midwestern state. The settlement was $850 million. That's one case. Okay, so back to my point about the money that's at stake here. Well, I know I went fast, but my friend is giving me a prompt here. I'll be around if you want to ask me any questions. My associate, Macy Codina, is here somewhere in the back there. She and I work very closely with Jorge on these issues, and we're here to answer any questions. Last comment I'll make, I used to worry about phthalates. Now, drink up, because like Dr. Teeve says, there's a lot of other things that you're being exposed to that maybe you ought to worry about. So thank you for being here.
Thank you, Ralph. Good job. Again, we'll hold question and answers for the last presentations, which is coming up. Dr. Fiorenza with Arcadis. I think she is coming remotely. There she is.
Yes, I am. I'm coming remotely. Thank you for that opportunity and for bearing with me being remote. So let me see. I think I will. Let me go full screen, okay? All right. So, hi, I'm Stephanie Fiorenza with Arcadis, but I am very active in ASTM. So I am going to discuss with you some of the activities that Committee E50, where I am a vice chair, has undertaken to address the PFAS issue. So this is just one committee that is working on PFAS within ASTM. Okay, this is the Environmental Assessment, Risk Management, and Corrective Action Committee. And this is where risk-based corrective action was developed, and also the standard practice for environmental site assessment. And so we have a number of either new PFAS-related standards being developed, or we have some that are being revised to take into account PFAS, and I'll just be running through those in my presentation. So our new guides are in the analytical and sampling realms. So we have new guidance that we've developed on how to understand what method to select for PFAS. You know, if you have a PFAS analysis, that's if you have a choice. How to undertake, you know, data evaluation when you have analytical results on PFAS. We also have guidance we're developing on sample collection, although I am not presenting that today. And then we have management practices for PFAS that are new, including investigation-derived waste, and we're revising we've revised the practice on site assessment and conceptual site models for PFAS. So these are the guidance documents that I'll be going through just to give you an idea of what's new and what we've updated. So the analytical method selection guide, why did we undertake this? There's a lot of confusion. You know, if you're not mandated to use a specific method, it's hard for the general user to know how to select a method. So we present, you know, some information that will help the user, you know, do so. We compare target analyte lists, we compare different features of the analytical methods, and then we also have information on, you know, research trends that are coming in the PFAS analytical realm. So for example, we have tables that compare methods, and the work was done in 2021, published at the beginning of 2022. So you can see we don't have method 1633 here, but that's coming out in a revision that's due to be released this year. And so you can see we compare the number of analytes, what preservatives, how the method's calibrated. We do compare on a number of other parameters. I just, you know, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through all of those. And we have EPA methods, we have ASTM methods. So there is a different committee that's developed analytical methods through ASTM. And then there are ISO methods, you know, so we're trying to be a little more broad brush in this document. We also compare what analytes are covered by the different methods. So this is, as I say, just a snippet. You know, there are like 40 analytes in method 1633, so that table is not going to fit on the slide, but we do have tables like that, you know, in the guidance document itself. We also have a section on methods that are being developed that are more semi-quantitative or qualitative to look at total PFAS. So we have the information on the total oxidizable precursor assay, methods to analyze for total organic fluorine, which is actually a draft EPA method now. We have information on non-target analysis, meaning if you're looking for some exotic compound that might have been detected at your site, or that can help you understand, you know, forensically what might be yours and what might be someone else's. We also have information on some research development, and PIGGY is how this is pronounced. It's another total fluorine method, and the combustion gas analyzer method. And forgive me for blasting through this, but I know we have a lot of ground to cover, and we want to make sure we have a robust question answer section. So we also have tables comparing, the total PFAS methods. As you can see, what kind of instrumentation is required, pros and cons for the different methods, and also, are they commercially available or are they still considered research? So the analytical methods selection standard, as I indicated, it was published at the beginning of last year. It already had one update last summer, and it's now being revised to take into account what we're hoping is going to be the fourth release and maybe final release of draft method EPA 1633 and also method 1621. It will also cover interferences, and we'll have updated analyte comparison tables. We're also developing a guidance document to help with PFAS data evaluation. This has sections on topics such as project planning, communicating with the lab, if any of you are in the business of collecting samples and submitting them. When it comes to PFAS, it's a lot more complicated. You have to understand things like project schedules and turnaround time. The turnaround time right now for commercial labs is running 12 to 16 weeks. I'm not joking. That is the turnaround time. So imagine, if you've been told, you need to conduct an investigation, and, it's going to be maybe 6 months before you really have validated data that you can discuss. It's also important to understand the detection limit that the lab can achieve, because we're talking in low parts per trillion, and most of the labs that are doing this work can achieve that, but you might want to find out about interferences. Also, what if you have a very impacted site and there have to be dilutions? What does that do to your detection level? And then we'll also want to talk about quality control and quality control excursions. So what we have in this data evaluation guide is we discuss items such as, say, this is just field duplicates, so this is kind of easy, but we tell you, ways to evaluate that. What if, your sample and duplicate result don't match? So we, present different possibilities, what the evaluation might be, and then sort of the qualification you should put on the data. We also compare some state guidance, because a number of states have their own data evaluation guidance. And so we go through the elements of individual state guidance, which will govern, if you happen to be located in one of those states, until we have, something new from the federal level. The status of the data evaluation guide is that it's in draft. We've gone through the first subcommittee ballot last year. We're undertaking revisions and are looking to ballot at the main committee level in this summer. June, maybe optimistic, but we think we'll get there. Now, we have a number of standards that are being revised for PFAS. The first one, this is actually a new standard, and this was on investigation derived waste, and that was actually published, sort of the first one published out of our group of sort of new PFAS work. And this guide addresses management of liquid waste and solids in containers. For right now, it's still not regulated under RCRA or CERCLA, as we heard from the previous speaker, but wait till that happens. As he said, there will be even more. This guidance document will have to be revised too. We've also developed or updated guidance on developing conceptual site models in light of PFAS. So we've added information that is specific to PFAS and how it is handled in the environment, or I should say how it behaves in the environment. Lastly, the site assessment guidance. This is the one that's used in commercial real estate transactions. Many of you may be familiar with this. It's 1527. Now 21 has been added for its revision. So it's the most common environmental evaluation in the US. And so This references the CERCLA definition of hazardous substance, but right now that does not include PFAS. This will have to be revised once again. But a number of sections were amended in the standard practice. It was balloted actually back in 2021, and there have been a number of discussions with EPA about the language and revisions that have been taken since then. It was finally accepted by US EPA in December of last year. And so that was a very rapid version of ASTM Committee E50's activities in the realm of PFAS. And if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. And you're also more than welcome to join ASTM. Membership's open to everyone, and we're always looking for expertise to add, to the development and revision of standard guides. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Fiorenza. We got about 5 to 10 minutes. I'm sure there are some questions for the panelists. We can start down on the floor. Any questions for the EPA, Ralph or Dr. Fiorenza? Hands up right there at the very, on my right, actually.
So this is probably aimed more at Ralph, but I would say don't hesitate, any one of you, to provide your input. But so the federal standard's coming out at some point this year. I guess my question is, what is the most troubling of all of those in your from your perspective?
Well, did I hear Aaryn say you got 60,000 comments? Did I hear that right?
Yeah, on the CERCLA proposal.
Oh, in the CERCLA proposal,
And we're at 50 on the drinking water.
50,000?
Not done yet.
Okay, so we have a long way to go. I don't think that rule is going to be effective anytime soon, because I can practically guarantee you there will be maybe not 50 or 60,000, but lots of challenges to that rule. So I think a lot has to happen between now and then. I think the practical answer is that it's virtually unenforceable. It's unenforceable because, as you heard me say, it's effectively a zero criteria. It's everywhere. There's not an approved, reasonable, let alone cost-effective treatment technology. I don't know what's going to happen ultimately, but that's the most disturbing thing. As a practical matter, this is the kind of issue we see them from time to time. Hey, look, CERCLA was created because of a problem that local, state, and federal government couldn't otherwise get their arms around, right? Because of Love Canal. And they created a funding opportunity to deal with that. We might need something like that here. Or we might need Congress to appropriate several $1 billion to the CERCLA fund and have it managed by the feds. I'm okay with that. There's just not enough money. There's just not enough money, let alone proven technology to deal with it right now. That's the practical problem.
I may add that DEP is mandated to come up with a standard by January 2025. So they conceivably, if this rule gets challenged in federal court, the federal MCL, DEP has to start workshops in 6 months, because the legislature has said you got to come up with a standard in the state. So there's that other element in the equation that we don't want to go ahead and lose sight of. DEP has to come up with a standard.
Yes, hi, good morning. Thank you for the presentations. Stephanie had mentioned ISO. And so it seems like there's some harmonizing going on between ASTM and ISO, which kind of got me thinking, and maybe this is a question for Aaryn there at the EPA, but is this an American issue? I mean, do we own the PFAS problem? How global is this, and where would you rate it against global warming and other things that the world is sort of confronting at this moment. Thank you. Thank you for taking my question.
No, we very much a global problem, as even just thinking broadly as a freight and transport issue. There's PFAS in the Arctic, you know. But yes, Europe is very engaged, the European Union. There are 5 member countries that are looking to do kind of a total PFAS ban right now, and they've proposed that. And just know peripherally that Australia is also, you know, grappled with a lot of site-specific PFAS issues and are, you know, looking for ways to. So it's very much a global issue. And, you know, our TSCA program is here in the United States working on our issues on importing and, you know, trying to better control things that might be coming or being manufactured in countries where they can still make those longer chain PFAS that we phased out. You know, so there's just it is a patchwork of issues across the entire planet. Yes.
And let me add to that, again, another factoid from my good friend Chris Teeth. They found PFAS at the top of Mount Everest. Okay, so when I said it's the everywhere chemical, we mean it.
Yeah, and polar bear blood too, in the poles as well. Hey, I have 2 questions. One's for Ralph and one's for Aaryn and Jorge. The first is, I understand that a lot of the litigation cases, and there's probably thousands across the country, are kind of being put on hold because of the bellwether, the top 10 bellwether. I was just curious what the status of those bellwether cases are. And the second question is, so EPA's come out with the draft MCL4, and we have in Florida until February 2025. Does EPA think that number will be finalized by February of 2025? So Ralph, you want to go first?
Oh, okay, well, sure. They're on hold right now. In fact, the judge, kind of remarkably in my experience, said no settlements will be entertained or approved either, which I've never seen before. Like if I want to settle and the defendant wants to settle, we can't settle, but the judge ultimately has to approve settlements. That's another quirk of the multi-district litigation. So there's nothing happening in those cases right now. Discovery is already pretty much over with. It's joint discovery. They're focusing in on some of the legal issues like evidentiary standards. Expert witnesses have pretty much been deposed. It's starting in a couple weeks, and we'll see what happens. Judge.
It's a main trial.
On the finalization of our, you know, proposed enforceable level, I think we're laser focused on finalizing that by the end of this year. Internally, I haven't heard any, you know, budging on that as far as extending a comment period or anything that would push it out any further. So again, we're looking to finalize that by the end of calendar year 2023. To Ralph's point, that, you know, as soon as it finalizes, we're probably going to see a lot of challenges to that. So, and as far as being effective
In Florida.
Yeah.
Yeah. It might be resolved by then, but typically these administrative challenges take a long time to resolve. And I think you're looking at massive industry opposition. Again, as much about the practical aspects, as I mentioned, as the technical and scientific ones. But we're going to be litigating that for a long time. And then the same is true in Florida, because Florida, you know, while it will follow suit with EPA and has done so many times in the past, adopting as groundwater standards, the MCLs, things like that, they still have to prove up their criteria.
But part of the issue in Florida is that whatever standard DEP comes up, whether they adopt the 4 parts per trillion, 400 parts per trillion, 40 parts per trillion, we don't know. The legislature has to ratify, and the legislature is going to want to know what is the cost to the taxpayer, to industry, to remediate PFAS. And we don't have a number. And you know, you can pull out any number, but it's surely going to be very expensive. Let's say the petroleum program, it's spent $2.5 billion since its inception back in the 90s. Conceivably, you could take that number to the legislature as a case scenario and say, well, legislature is going to take between $2 and $4 billion to remediate PFAS using all the tools we have in the toolbox, risk-based corrective action, end user risk approach. It's still going to take money. So the legislature would probably be sticker shocked when they see that number. And what may translate is that they may not ratify the standard that DEP comes through. We may not have a standard in 2025. What does that really mean? We don't know.
That's an excellent point. I should have mentioned that. I've never seen that either in all my years of doing this, where a standard is brought back to the legislature, where it's subject to, let's face it, the political process and a lot of stakeholders that, including but not limited to local governments that may be concerned about having that criteria or standard imposed upon them. And I think to Jorge's point, I alluded to it earlier when I mentioned the super fund that was created to deal with hazardous substances issues. I think it is going to require a petroleum or dry cleaner type program funded somehow. I don't know how.
We don't know.
To address the issues, because I think it's fair to say, even though local government home rule has increasingly come under attack from Tallahassee, we don't want our local governments going bankrupt. And I don't know of one, and I work with some large ones that can afford the bill that they're going to have to pay for PFAS.
So we're going to wrap. Sorry, go ahead. One more question.
Sure. Ralph, you mentioned the $850 million settlement. I happen to live in the community that's affected by that. We like in these developing sciences, we like proxies to understand. So to provide a little context to that, that was 3 landfills running between 1 and 10 part per billion of PFAS, and affected 7 municipalities. Let's call it around 200,000 people. And so let's call it around 275 million per landfill for cleanup. So, but in a pretty highly populated area. And then reconciling that with the recognition that Amara Strand, 20 years old, passed away of a rare liver cancer last month. And she's considered being referred to as kind of the first attributed case to that. So I don't know if I'm necessarily looking for an answer other than, or an answer, but that just we're kind of trying to reconcile those two things.
I'm glad you mentioned that. I didn't mention, because I'm focusing on regulatory issues, but personal injury cases are coming, folks. The Morgan and Morgans of the world, don't mind name dropping them because I'm sure they don't mind being name dropped, are coming. They're signing up people all over Kingdom Come to bring these personal injury cases. They're actually representing the city of Stewart in the Bellwether case, but the personal injury cases like the ones you're talking about for liver cancer and the other things Dr. Teep can talk about, those are coming. And again, how do you put a price tag on that? I mean, aside from the human tragedy, the cost of dealing with that is beyond anything I've ever seen.
Robin?
All right, last question, then we're going to go to break.
Thank you for the presentation. So this is the question to each of you. So what do we do in the interim? Do we focus on the 4 PPT? Like if we're not a local government, we're not a landfill or a airport, but we're a developer, and there's PFAS that has migrated onto a property that we're looking to redevelop. Ralph, what do you recommend to your clients for the best management practices? Do they focus on this? And it's a Florida site, 70 PPT, the coming up 4 PPT. And, to Aaryn and Jorge, what do you, from your perspective, what do you recommend? What do we do in this state of flux?
It's a great question, Robin. I already answered it. Drink up. But I give conservative advice. I think you do too. We've talked about it before. Even before the ASTM, I said you need to include in your AAI due diligence, all appropriate inquiries, PFAS. And I said at the time, the 7 parts per trillion number. If you want to be prudent and you want to avoid being asked questions later, why didn't you tell me that? I think you should assume it's going to be 4. And I think you should make your risk management decisions based on that.
I second. We are aware that DEP is sending letters to some responsible parties saying that the standard is going to be 4 official letters from DEP. Yep. And so I second what Ralph said. If you have a transaction, it's a business risk right now, but once it gets regulated, retroactive liability will come and get you. So maybe you want to test for it, especially if your consultant has serious indications that PFAS may have been used, released, or inadvertently received from somebody else.
Let me real quickly add to that. Jorge used the word reopener. That ought to scare the death out of everybody, because under 62-780, if there's a newly discovered problem, a new criteria even, the department says it has the right to go back even at closed sites and reopen them to start focusing on a contaminant of concern that was never a contaminant of concern before. Be afraid.
Well, with that cheery note,
Thank you, everybody.
thank you, panel. Fantastic. We are at break in the exhibit hall. We've got coffee,